Welcome to my presentation on promoting deeper discussions. I'm Kevin Cranbiel from Middle Tennessee State University. First, let's do some quick introduction just to set things up. So we've got a lot of elementary teachers, secondary teachers, teacher education teachers. We're working with a lot of people, but the world today we live in is one that is extremely fast-paced. Everyone is on their phones all the time with a stream of constant flowing information from all sorts of sources. Our feed is literally never ending. In fact, it cultivates a sense that a lot of our students have of "I want it now." And all of this in the light of technology in particular and how we can integrate it in a way that is effective for cultivating discussions poses some challenges for us to think about it. Marianne Wolf, in her work Reader Come Home, does a great job on summarizing some of the challenges and structural changes that is made to our cognitive architecture through living entirely in a digital environment. Sherry Turkle in Alone Together highlighted some other challenges and concerns to take about with regards to the more social side of our interactions with one another when we are bound up and tied to technology. And so technology is something that we obviously advocate for its use of, but we also don't want to just be swept up in the way that the world is using it. We want to leverage it in ways that enhance learning insofar as it comes to the classroom. So with that said here, let's think about this context here. Tendency for discussions in this world in which we currently live, technologically driven, is short and fast. Put 144 characters and do it now. Your friends send you a text message, they expect a reply right now. You read your posts on Twitter, these things are short and sweet. Articles online, they even have a little phrase called TLDR so you can read the short version instead of something else. So all of this creates an environment where the students are expecting and used to fast-paced, short duration work, and that challenges things. Now, some might say, well, isn't it authentic for these learners who are digital natives to apply this because they can kind of this is the way they operate. Research has demonstrably said that that's false. The idea of the digital natives is largely a myth. It is not supported by research, and although students who are younger are much more familiar with the use of technology, they're not familiar with its use for the purpose of enhancing learning. And the bottom line is that multitasking has been shown for decades to lead to lower productivity just by definition, because you are actually not multitasking. What you're doing is task switching. Our brain isn't capable of doing two things at once, so it switches back and forth, reducing the effectiveness of both. So the bottom line is that in this environment where students are inundated with the pressure to respond quickly, to go fast, to multitask, to just integrate technology anyway the problem is we have these challenges for this. Now, in addition to this context, we also do know some things from study of our cognition. Number one, to maximize learning, desirable difficulties are actually something that are extremely helpful. Now, these desirable difficulties include things like spaced practice, spacing out your practice over time. Having students elaborate upon material, that means extended explanations and detailed discussions about what something is, implications of it, and so forth. And just retrieval practice, which is tapping back into your memory rather than looking something up on a device. And all of these strategies, which have a long track record of finding consistent success to deep learning, are better suited to slower paced environments. So let's shift this contextual feature to our topic at hand. We want to talk about discussions in a technologically infused world and how we can make those more productive. Well, first off, let's just begin with why do we share some discussions. If we're in a collective group, I'd share out some ideas now, but since this is asynchronous, I'll zoom right ahead. I think most of us would agree the primary reason that we utilize discussion is to promote learning. And if that's the case, then it's important that we recognize that there's some basic principles that we can operate from that will enhance that. So here's just a couple of what these are. I'm summarizing from Dan Willingham's work. He's got a nice, short, easy read book called Why Don't Students Like School? And these principles are derived from that. They're actually derived from a separate book that I wrote, but they align with it. So first off, learning requires extended thought. We need to respect the cognitive limits. That is, our brain is only able to handle so much, and so in a learning environment, we need to control and create it in such a way that it respects those limits. Knowledge builds upon prior knowledge, so that what the students bring to the table is an important feature for discussions. And then also we know that knowledge first and skill comes after. Now it doesn't mean it cannot happen the other way, but the more knowledge one has about something, the better apt they are to apply the skill associated with it. So we use discussions for all of these reasons. Here's a few other ideas to think about that we want to note. We don't want to simply celebrate ignorance, but we want to build knowledge. That it carries with it its implication that it's going to be purposeful. We don't want to just discuss the superficial aspects of something. We want to dig deeply into text. And that carries with it an implication that not just any topic, but we've got to pick specific topics, those with students already have knowledge established. Otherwise, we're going to hover on these superficial areas. And then lastly, we want to not just express opinions already held, but actually to cultivate and reflect on our understanding about these topics. That implication is that we don't want to have these discussions serve as just a mirror. We actually want them to be a window to another world, to interact and understand someone else in their view. And all this is to say that when we are doing these discussions, a drive-by by itself is not sufficient. A nice little story of this, my wife, her parents, we used to live in Arizona, and they drove to the Grand Canyon one day. They got there, they got out by the side there, they took some pictures, and then they left. Their mom, dad said, "Hey, we've been there, we've seen it," and they go. This is not the type of thing we want to have in our discussions where it's a drive-by. We got there, we took a picture, we showed we were done. No, we got to get into that canyon and dig in. And it's a nice analogy to think about discussions in these environments, because people are pulled a mile a minute. There's always something next on the agenda. But if we're going to honor discussions for the purpose of learning, drive-bys won't do it. We've got to dig in and get into that canyon that is to be learned. So let's draw from kind of an old classical idea for these, the driving way to lead deeper discussions, and we'll do that through what's called festina lente. It's Latin for to make haste, move slowly. A couple of images here to show this. You'll notice both images, they show a slow thing, an anchor, or some sort of turtle-looking thing, but then coupled with something fast, a quick-moving fish coupled with the anchor, or a ship. You see these the sail pairing them. Haste isn't made by racing through things. It's actually made by slowing down when it comes to learning. And I think this classical strategy is a good way we can operate from to drive discussions in technological environments. Let's expect that we're going to make haste not by going fast, but by slowing down. So let me give you some strategies to help guide these deeper discussions and thinking about them specifically in this technologically enhanced mindset. So first off, basic strategy here, but do your prep work. Doing good discussions requires a lot of prep by both you and your students. And so a small example to kind of think about for this there is, if you want people to go on this path, it's like an apprenticeship model. You need to know kind of where you're going, what the end point is, but you also want your students on that path where they can kind of see themselves on this journey. In my old history class, I kind of had students play the role of historian's apprentice, and I pretended I was the historian. They were apprentices. And so they would study and do some prep work towards moving on this level of excellence. So how do we do this prep work? What's the important features? Number one, build some pre-scripted questions. Let's take an analogy right out of the football game plans there. You know, a lot of coaches will have a first drive that's scripted before the game, and they hope to follow it just like it's planned. Lay things out ahead of time. We all know that the best laid plans don't survive first contact with the enemy, but the best laid plans provide for better adaptation than no laid plans. So build some scripted questions and anticipate where you expect to go and where you want to go. Second, create a chart that kind of thinks about those things that you must discuss, those things that would be nice to discuss, and those things not to discuss. And so I've just got a few small examples that are just general here, but thinking about discussions online or whether it be synchronous or asynchronous, those must discuss components are going to include the essential vocabulary. Is there something they really need to understand in this text as they're discussing around it so they can have so they can make meaning from it there? Is there essential content that we've got to interact with? And is there specific, really important connections they really need to make? These things kind of fall in this must discuss category. Nice to discuss topics might be connections to other domains. And the reason I put this in the nice to discuss categories is because they might be of relevance and they're probably very good, but probably our depth is going to be limited by the capacity that our students may or may not have prior knowledge across that. And then I'll throw in a surprise area for the not to discuss, and that's in personal experiences. Now, I didn't say personal connections, but personal experiences often are distracting for discussions because no one else in the room has had the same experience, or if they have, it's been unique, and they'll see it and they'll make a surface connection that may or may not be there. So an interesting thing to think about is try to avoid moving away from it. Remember, move away from the mirror and change to shift towards a window. Help them look out and see the text, see one another rather than just see themselves. And then lastly, in terms of this prep work, just review the text and related materials looking for intentional connections so you see them in advance, and as the discussion flows, as you're interacting, you can steer people in that direction. Second strategy I want to suggest for these deeper discussions is to avoid what I call the primacy of the personal. We live in a world where people are expected to really showcase this personalization. You've already seen me make a few points against it. I think we want to avoid it. And let me give an example from that out of your churches. For anyone who goes to church, whether you're Christian or not, you'll know this language and you'll know the examples that I'm pulling from it here. This is a verse taken right out of the Bible. I'm not sure which book. My apologies to those Christians in the room. But oftentimes people will cite it. It says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." And because our world is always focused on you, people tend to make a student-centered interpretation. They say, well, it says, don't judge, period. The problem is that this student choice, voice, perspective, this you sort of centered way of interpreting things makes things all about them. If you're trying to interpret text, it's important to know it's not about you. You are the one doing the interpreting, but you're interpreting someone else's writing. So let's go back and look at this a little more depth. Let's take this verse in its full context. Here's the full sentence. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take out the speck of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Notice in that fifth verse there, which is connected. This is not a separate thought. This is all connected together. It specifically says, don't be a hypocrite. First, clean up your own mess, and then clean up your brother's. It doesn't say don't judge. It says don't judge hypocritically. And so this is a good example of avoiding this primacy of the personal. We want them to understand and interact texts, whether they are discussion posts by their colleagues, in the mindset of the person who wrote them, not my own interpretations. We really got to dig into the depth, and slowing down the strategy, encouraging people to avoid this sort of practice is going to lead to deeper discussions. So we focus on the text, not themselves. A third strategy, and I'll go through this one quickly because I know time is running short here. Do not underestimate the value of reading together. Even read-alouds are incredibly helpful for students, especially secondary students who may not have the same literacy capacity as others. They often know the words, but they have to spend so much effort cognitively to try to understand and break down the words. Having someone read it aloud makes a big difference. So see if you can't invest in those sorts of approaches. Look for silent readings. The bottom line is have some collective reads and think about it from this vantage point. If we're doing something around a discussion and we're centered collectively together, engage in it, we probably better make sure on a low baseline is that everyone has read it together. If it's not too long, think about ways you can do this together. So that's a third strategy to think about. Fourth strategy, ask a lot of questions. But I'm going to just give you 3 specific questions that you can use to kind of guide thinking about it. Notice here I've made a few comments here for it. We don't want to sit there and belittle these lower order questions. Often they lead to later order questions, and they're really important to have. And for that, we want our students also asking questions of one another. But let me give you 3 just general guiding questions that you can use to steer conversations towards great depth. First, what do you mean by that? Second, how did you come to that conclusion? And third, have you ever considered? These 3 questions are extremely flexible, malleable, and you can use them to guide conversations consistently. And in doing so, you're teaching students and modeling them that before we respond, we ask for clarification. What do you mean by that? Secondarily, we're always asking for evidence. How did you come to that conclusion? And third, let's be open to possibilities of what if. Have you ever considered? 3 incredibly helpful, malleable prompting questions that you can use to guide deeper discussions. I know you guys have all heard about the Socratic method, and we won't have time with my time running up for it there, but this is a great strategy to think about it. This slide will be one that I think you might want to capture a screenshot of. These different forms of questioning really help to guide it. Again, question, question, question. Last strategy, map the discussion. This is taken right out of a group called Touchstones. But assign somebody who's involved to actually map the discussion. If you're in an online environment, you as the faculty or a GA can just sit there and create a map of how we're conversing with one another. It's really interesting and a helpful, reflective way to think about who's participating, who are they interacting with, are there pockets emerging within our environment, and I think in the online environment this is even more